Okay, welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jason Lodge. I head up the Learning, Instruction and Technology Lab in the School of Education at the University of Queensland. So I'm coming to you from Meanjin on the Maiwar, otherwise known as Brisbane on the Brisbane River, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of these lands. This is our panel. It's the final panel of the conference, which means we're either doing the headline shift or the graveyard, one or the other, maybe a little bit of both, and that's okay. We do have the topic for this panel of innovating assessment in the age of AI. I will introduce you to our panelists in a second, our slightly reduced panel for this session. But I wanted to sort of start by painting a broader picture about where I think the conversation about AI and assessment is going. Now, obviously, there's been considerable emphasis over the last, well, nearly 3 years now on cheating as one of the main concerns since the emergence of ChatGPT. And this is still playing out across education sectors around the world. There are still some jurisdictions where they are still attempting to ban the use of AI with their student populations, which, as many of us know, is fairly pointless because most of those students know how to set up a VPN and get around those bans very quickly. So banning or ignoring this is not really an option as far as our assessment thinking goes. But I think it's fair to say that while ChatGPT and other generative AI tools and now automated decision-making systems like AI agents are shining a light on some of the problems with assessment, many of the things that we're grappling with were problems before this. So, there is something about this idea that we can take a snapshot of a student's learning through a piece of work that they submit or an exam that they sit, and that tells us something about their trajectory as learners over time. There was always a bit of a problem with that. Here in Australia, David Bowd and colleagues put together a document called Assessment 2020. That was 15 years ago now, and if we had have met some of the aspirations that were mapped out in that document, perhaps we wouldn't find ourselves in the situation that we are in at the moment. I think where we find ourselves now, and there's been some news stories here in Australia about this over the last couple of days, is that there is still in some places a strong focus on this idea that we can detect AI use, which is very quickly falling apart. There are no reliable and valid AI detectors out there, I'm sorry to say, for anybody who's still holding out hope for that one. So it does mean that we need to rethink some of the things that we're doing in assessment. I think our colleague Kath Ellis probably said this best. Our job is not ultimately, as educators, is not to look for evidence of cheating. We're not the learning police or the cheating police, but ultimately we're trying to find evidence that students have learned the things that we would hope that they have learned. So we're looking for evidence of learning, or, as the case may be, evidence of no learning. And to do that, we have to think about learning as both a process and an outcome. But of course, many of our education systems are set up in such a way that the inputs and the outputs are the things that we focus on, and we don't necessarily spend enough time looking at that process. So I think where we find ourselves broadly at the moment is that there are no real clear answers to this problem of AI and assessment. It probably is going to require some structural change to the way that we assess students across different levels of education. The bottom line, I think, and this partly is represented in the way that higher education in Australia is legislated, is that we are required by law to assure that our students have done the learning that they must do. So it's put a lot of pressure on higher education institutions in Australia to manage this problem. And I think what it boils down to is that we really need to know our students and their learning. And perhaps our education systems are not set up in the best way to be able to do that. So of the things that we have on the table that we can do about this now, one that obviously comes up quite a lot is exams. Now, exams still have a place, I think, in many education systems, but they're not the whole answer. Right? I teach future teachers who are going to be in schools next year. I'm not interested in what they know about something that they can recall in an exam scenario. I need to know that they can walk into a classroom next February and do a good job of facilitating the learning of their students. So the assessment that I assign needs to align with that in some way. That can be demonstrate how you would write a lesson plan, which AI can help you with, but then you show me how you will execute that plan and you tell me why that plan is important to be executed in that way. So this is something that I've attempted this year is interactive oral assessment at scale. Again, this is not the only answer that's out there, but I think for me as an educator, it was very enlightening to be able to have those conversations with the students and get a sense of who they are as teachers beyond what I might have seen in a written submission. So there are some answers emerging, I think, but certainly there are still some significant challenges out there. One of those is about online assessment, and given the ability to be able to use AI tools to deep fake themselves, students to deep fake themselves, whether or not that has some sort of future, or we need to go back to some form of on the ground in-person assessment. What does online assessment look like into the future? There are, of course, vast differences as a global audience. We will be aware of this. There's differences across education sectors in how this is being handled across different countries. This looks different in different disciplines and is impacting in very different ways. On top of that, I think many of us realise that there's a growing sense of unease about the potential impact that AI technologies are having on education more broadly. These aren't systems that were made for educational purposes, so there is work to be done for us to think about how we integrate them in effectively. So that's a sort of broader background to set the scene for what we're going to talk about in this panel. So I will introduce you to our two esteemed panelists who are going to help tease apart some of this with us today. Joanna is Associate Professor at the Centre for Research in Assessment in Digital Learning, Cradle at Deakin University. Her research and assessment focuses on inclusion and diversity, which are very important, and we're going to talk about that, feedback literacies, developing evaluative judgment, and student experiences across the university and workplace. She has a background in medicine and health professions education. Welcome, Jo. We'll throw a question to you shortly. Dr. Yizhou Van is Assistant Professor and Research Fellow at the Graduate School of Education, Peking University, and Adjunct Research Fellow at Monash University. His research focuses on AI in education and science, AI literacy, learning analytics, and self-regulated learning. And unfortunately, Rafael Mello was unable to join us this morning. He's had an issue that emerged that meant he's not going to be able to participate in this panel, unfortunately. So we will potentially have a little bit more space to have a bit of a conversation. So please feel free to use the Q&A in the Hoover, however you say it, app, or use the chat. Entirely up to you. And I will keep an eye on both of those things as we go. So let's get into some questions for our panelists. Yizhou, your work uses learning analytics to reveal the hidden processes of learning, such as self-regulation and learning tactics. Traditionally, assessment has focused on the final product, as we mentioned in the opening. How does generative AI create new possibilities, not only to assess, but to also actively support and scaffold these learning processes in real time, particularly in terms of what this might mean for assessment?
Yeah. Thank you, Jason, for this question. I think this is a very important question. But first of all, generative AI kind of creates this huge opportunity by creates this huge challenge because previously lots of like teachers or in the teacher training we discuss how to improve your assessment, but many teachers they have a traditional assessment setup, but they are reluctant to change or revise it. But generative AI kind of rush into the learning process assessment, and many teachers they now came to us saying, "Oh, we must change our assessment, otherwise we can't properly evaluate the students." So this huge challenge brings all together all these huge possibilities. This is the first thing. The second thing, I think, from the learning analytics point of view, we used to create lots of methods or technology to analyze learners' learning process. For example, in the Flora project we participate, we collected the learners' trace data, which shows how they engaged in this learning task, how they, for example, finish this essay, instead of collecting the final product of the written essay. So then we unpack the learning process, use self-regulated learning model, and then analyze their data and provide scaffoldings back to the students to trigger their cognitive and metacognitive engagement. This model in the Flora project, we used to do it afterwards, right? The researchers collect the data, analyze, and design scaffolds provide to learners. But now with generative AI and explainable AI, for example, SHOP, we can automatically collect, analyze learners' trace data, learning process, tactic, and analyze the importance of different features in their learning and in terms of their prediction of their final skills and knowledge improvement. Then we can kind of translate these features to explainable AI and generative AI to provide automatic and personalized scaffoldings back to the learners. So in this way, generative AI can help us not only to access or formative access students' learning, but also provide feedback to their learning. This is the second part. I think at the same time, as the teachers, when we design assessment, we also need to think about the role of AI, not only as a tool or as a tutor, like or TA, but we also need to embed AI already in the learning. For example, we can consider generative AI as kind of pedagogical agent that we can use AI in the assessment. In the writing and in the medical practice, we are trying to, for example, in the clinical reasoning course, we used to only like let the students to read the cases, analyze the cases at the final exam, the practice with a standardized patient. But with generative AI, the teachers can design a virtual standardized patient using generative AI. So AI now plays the role of a patient. Then the medical students, start to practice with this virtual standardized patient. And during this process, there is another role, which is a senior doctor can analyze learners' dialogue with this virtual patient and provide feedback. For example, oh, you have been asking these questions. How about think about the logic of your questions and then improve your clinical reasoning? And all this practice can kind of connect to the final assessment, which learners demonstrate their thinking process, not the final decision, right? Well, what is the problem? So moving from the product to the learning process is very important, and learning analytics can help this. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Yizhou. So a lot in there. That was a great answer. Thank you. I hear you where you started and talked about the reluctance to change assessment, and it's hard. I have 250 students in my class, and the processes that I need to go through to make those changes absolutely are difficult. I think you make a good point about how AI is also potentially part of the solution here, as well as part of the problem. And that, I guess, is something that we probably as a community need to have a think about what that looks like. And you've certainly given some good examples of how that might play out. You also fed through in there some ideas about clinical reasoning, which is a nice segue over to you, Joe. So in a world where AI can produce competent essays and code and designs, and the definition of an authentic assessment, whether it's clinical reasoning or something else, is come under some challenge. So you've done a lot of work on this idea of evaluative judgment. Can you tell us a little about how you see that fitting in here, and what are we thinking about when we think about what is truly authentic in the types of things that we want to assess?
Thanks, Jason. Complicated question. So evaluative judgment is a term we came up with that builds on the work of many other people, Sadler, Roy Sadler in particular, around this idea that students need to develop an understanding of quality for themselves. And that is part of what we are hoping to do in an education setting, right? So ideally, eventually, when the graduates go out into whatever environment they're going into, they will be able to tell for themselves, am I doing a good enough job? Is somebody else in this environment doing a good enough job? And a little bit about, and to get to that point, they kind of need to engage with sort of agreed upon standards or accepted ways of doing things, what might be acceptable in a profession, up to standard. So in getting to that stage, and this is something that we think that only humans can do, right? So AI might be great at reconstituting rubrics, guidelines, interpreting standards, but ultimately humans are the ones who judge quality of work. And so this is perhaps the core idea behind, the set of things that we still want to develop in humans versus the set of things that we might be able to offload to AI or get AI to help us with. So then comes the question, as Jason said, well, what kind of assessment can help us do this thing? So firstly, develop evaluative judgment, but then the next bit is actually assessing. Have students developed that evaluative judgment? And I guess it comes back to that idea of assessment's multiple purposes. So you can have assessment that certifies, assures, judges that learners have learned something, but assessment also has this other role of supporting learners to develop their ability to help them learn, to support them beyond the immediate task and into whatever future they're going into, so they can be arbiters and judges of quality themselves. So when we get to that point, then we must make the decision about, well, which things are important for students to make evaluative judgments about. And this is really context dependent. What we want doctors to do, or medical students in that clinical reasoning, is probably quite different from what we want teachers to do in the classroom. Different again to what we want, accountants to do when they're auditing financial statements. So then the evaluative judgments become very context dependent, and how the assessment task is designed, what it involves, is going to devolve down to that specific disciplinary or professional area. So where does this end us up? I guess it means that we do actually need subject matter experts to be involved in designing appropriate assessments that support learning, but also can help us understand whether students have reached that capability or not. And I guess this means that we can't just, institute blanket solutions for assessment tasks. They actually do have to be specific to what we want to develop in students. And that's where ideas like learning outcomes and ensuring our learning outcomes are appropriate are really important.
Thanks, Joe. Oh, so much in that as well. Um, I've had to think about that a lot also, as I said, teaching future teachers. It was really interesting when I went through the process of developing a lesson plan using ChatGPT and then tried to teach it. And we attempted to teach it in exactly the way that ChatGPT sort of outlined for the session to run. And I found that really difficult because what the lesson plan was saying and the way that I prefer to teach and the sorts of judgments that I make as a teacher in a live lesson didn't line up. So I thought that was such a nice way of being able to show that my students about where their judgment is important. Yes, you can get AI to help produce a lesson plan for you, but at the end of the day, you have to embody and enact that lesson plan in a real way in a physical classroom with, 25 children or adolescents. So there's something really, I think, fundamental in there that you mentioned about what this looks like for every different kind of discipline and profession and how those judgments play out in different ways and what role AI might actually play in supporting some of those things. I also think it was important, something you alluded to about this not kind of being what's the bit that's left for humans, but these are the sorts of things that are fundamental to what it means to be a professional. So, I really like this notion of evaluative judgment as being a key part of all of that.
One extra
Sorry,
thing I
Joe.
should
Yeah.
add is that we also will need to develop evaluative judgment about AI and about AI outputs. Because
Absolutely.
I think, Yizhou already mentioned that, AI is going to be part of what we end up doing, our professional lives. So it's not just about us doing it or students doing it within this learning setting, but it's actually supporting students to be able to use AI well and appropriately in whatever they end up doing in the future. So it's not just evaluative judgment about particular professional tasks, but it's also evaluative judgment about the outputs of AI.
Really good point. Thank you. Yeah, well said. I might move to, we've got a question that's come on through here, so we might pick up on some of these questions as we go. Chris has said, evaluative judgment has always been an issue in automatic grading, writing samples in assessment. Can human grading content and creativity be replaced by AI? Oof. Given that follows on from your comments, Joe, would you like to have a crack at that one?
Yeah. Yes, I guess in all automatic grading kind of paradigms, and I guess this extends more broadly to what happens with AI. If they're looking for regular patterns for keywords for things that you might expect to find, then you're only ever going to be grading or giving marks to the things that are pretty standard, pretty average, the statistically probable solutions, right? So this really does hamper the outliers, the creative responses, things that are done differently. Um, that still might meet the overall idea or the brief of the assessment task, but actually come about it in a very different way. And I think even as humans, we can have problems with this. So the idea of marking and moderation, where if you've got a large class like Jason's 250 students, you're probably not going to be marking all 250 assessments yourself. You've got a team of people. So you have to ensure consistency across that team. And the way to get consistency is for everyone to agree, this is appropriate, this isn't appropriate. But even in those settings, I mean, I myself as a marker, I've come across assignments. I'm like, this really doesn't fit the idea of what we all agreed upon, but I can recognize that this thing is still done to an excellent standard and it still meets the overall brief. So I think there's a trap, and that trap already existed before AI, before automatic grading, about that concept of creativity and different ways to that divergence and diversity in responses to tasks. So I don't entirely know if human grading could be entirely replaced by AI. Certainly in sort of, more sort of basic tasks, if we're looking at information recall, looking at things that have very defined answers, closed problems, yeah, AI could probably do a very good job in those circumstances. But when you go to complex, open-ended problems, things that require creativity, I don't think we're going to be able to institute an AI solution to address problems with scale. So yeah, we're still going to need to have humans involved.
Thanks, Joe. That's a nice lead into our next question that we might open up with. And Yizhou, I'll hand this one over to you to start with. Something that I've noticed throughout the conference over the last couple of days is that we're still using a lot of metaphors and similes to understand what it is that we're really grappling with here. And Joe, you and I have had an exchange about e-bikes, for example. Um, Lots of metaphors out there, elevators and escalators and all sorts of stuff. So there's still a lot of conceptual grappling with some of the issues that we're dealing with here, particularly in terms of assessment. And I've already mentioned one about AI detectors. What are some of the other sort of big misconceptions or mistakes that are out there that we think that need a little bit more work for us to get a real handle on? Yishao, I'll start with you. What do you think's going on out there
Yeah.
that's not quite right?
I think about assessment. One thing is, in the past, we have an assumption that learners need to improve their skills and knowledge. So then they perform better, right? Because we were accessing their final product, for example, write an essay or a design or a lesson plan. Yeah, which was mostly true in the past. But nowadays with generative AI, when we only look at the final product, this can no longer represent the real learning or the improvement of skills and knowledge. Like we are not sure if students they use or how they use generative AI to create that homework, to finish that homework. Then we need to move from the product-oriented assessment to process and metacognition metacognition-oriented assessment because in our study we find that when we focus a lot about improving scores, improving the final performance, then we are mixing performance, or the students are also mixing performance and learning gain, which might cause their metacognition laziness, for example, rely or over-relying on generative AI, asking generative AI lots of practical questions, so they get quick and high valuable, high quality feedback from AI. Then they use it in their writing or solving a problem. But whether they really understand these concepts, whether they really can adjust their planning, their monitoring, their evaluation of the learning process, there's a big question mark there. So I think this part might be one of the big problem, yeah, in the design of assessment.
Yeah, great point. It's almost as though the process and the outcome have been decoupled, and we relied so much
Yeah,
on assessing the outcome to infer the process, cognitive
yeah,
and metacognitive, that we're now a bit kind of lost in, and we need to focus more on the sort of cognitive and metacognitive aspects as they're progressing over time, rather than just seeing the end result. Because you can just arrive at the end result without going through the work that is usually required, or previously was required to get there. Yeah, great point. Joe, what do you think? biggest misconception that you think is still out there?
Oh, I think the biggest misconception is also about um, just the fact that there might be tasks, and I think this comes to some of the commentary in the chat, like that we're really trying to scramble to respond to the capability of AI now, about the world as it is now, rather than also thinking about what might happen in the future. So when we talk about securing tasks and getting everyone back into exam rooms and writing with pens and paper, does this really help learners for the future, for their future? I mean, always the future is unpredictable, so we can't really figure out exactly what we should be doing. Um, but we can use our best guess to sort of, look forward to think about what it is that students might have to do in the future and what they might have to learn in order to be able to operate effectively in whatever future there is. I mean, it'd be great if we could do less work and give more tasks to AI and have more free time. Um, but um, it is likely that there's going to be, you know, substantial changes to the way that work happens, to what we see as required for humans to do versus, computers. And I mean, we're already seeing a lot of these changes happen. Um, I can think in the medical setting, AI scribing is such a big thing now, where instead of the doctor having to type stuff into the computer or the nurse having to type things into the computer about patient notes, there's an AI scribe listening and they're just transcribing everything. And technology is pretty good, so it might not always be 100% accurate, but this really changes the expected capabilities of, say, a doctor or a nurse in that patient interaction setting. We no longer have to handwrite notes, it's electronic. And then if we no longer have to take records or come back to take records, what else could we be doing in that environment? Um, so I think in trying to sort of hark back to the past and trying to, you know, turn the clocks back and go back to, in-person exams with pen and paper, what we're probably actually harming developing students' capabilities for the future.
Thanks, Joe. Such an important point. I always think about my job as being not just preparing my students for day one, but for day 3000. Well, what is my responsibility to help them to develop the kind of adaptive skills that they're going to need to be able to function in their job for that much longer period of time? Yeah, thank you. Really, really important. I think one of the big ones for me in terms of the misconceptions that are floating out there is that all of this problem about AI and assessment is just about securing assessment. Yes, that's important. Yes, we need to know that the student who is finishing high school or graduating with a degree has actually done the work. So don't get me wrong, security is a critical part of all of this. But I also think that there's a place in here when you compare what's happening in universities and higher education institutions to what's happening in, say, for example, senior secondary or high school. Um, the situation looks quite different because in high school, the educators are trained, so they have degrees in education. They know what they're doing. They have small classes, so they generally know their students, and they have a lot of time with those students. So if our task here is to know our students and their learning, you're going to have a much better time of doing that in those circumstances. So perhaps there are some questions we need to ask about the way that higher education is currently set up, in that it is really hard in many circumstances for us to know our students and their learning. Like I said, I think secure assessment is still a really important part of the equation, but there are some other ways in which the dynamics of higher education in particular are set up that we may need to question around all of this. I might just move us on now to the next question that I have for you, Joe, because I think this is a really important one, and I don't think it's had enough focus in the conversation to date. So a lot of your work has been emphasizing this idea of inclusive assessment design. Um, there are some concerns, and I think they're justified, that some responses to AI, such as what you've just talked about in terms of returning to in-person invigilated exams, may disproportionately disadvantage students from equity-bearing groups. I've heard similar arguments about interactive orals, as good as they are at being able to, have those conversations with the students. What do you think are some of the key principles or strategies that we might use to make sure that whatever our assessment regimes look like into the future are inclusive and accessible for all students? I know that's a big question, but I know you've done a lot of work on this, so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I think it's a really important part of how we're going to be thinking about design of assessments and how we think about the implementation of assessment. And I guess one of the biggest principles is to think about assessment not as just being that act that happens on the day when the student demonstrates a capability or submits that assessment task, but all the things that happen around, all the preparation, the scaffolding, even how the curriculum is delivered. All of these things build up to that moment of assessment being inclusive or not. And so we can think back to what might be happening in the classroom in terms of universal design for learning and how we might support learners to engage in different ways, so those multiple means of engagement and representation, in order to get to a point where there is possibility, and choice is potentially one of the ways to address some of those issues around inclusion. Choice in how students express themselves, how they submit the task. I know we still want to have tasks where we see people do things and observe or supervise that sort of process, as well as to ensure that the product that comes out perhaps is generated by that student. But thinking about the ways that we can involve choice, incorporate things that are more inclusive, can happen not just at the point of the assessment task, but all the way along. So how students choose to engage with different tools to develop their learning might go away to ensuring that what happens at the end is inclusive. Also being really clear about what the assessment task involves, and being clear about it early so that if and there will always be a need for some people to have adjustments, and it's a legal responsibility in Australia, as it is in many jurisdictions around the world. If there are adjustments or accommodations needed, say for people with disabilities or medical conditions, then we need to design assessment in a way that there is enough time for conversation and negotiation to take place, such that we can actually put something inclusive in place. So it's not, it's really not just about this is the set assessment task and there will be a few people who might not be able to do it. We need to think broadly about what would work for most people, and then think about the adjustments needed for the people who will ultimately not fit within our standard plan. In terms of specifically about the AI side of things, I think there are a lot of advocates in the space who have actually really said that AI has been really helpful and supportive for being inclusive. So in terms of people with dyslexia having an AI tool that helps them understand what's in the text, so they don't have to sort of encounter and sort of slog through the same amount of reading in the same way. For students who perhaps need a little bit more context, and sort of a chat buddy to help them puzzle through some of those things. AI tools can be really helpful for that as well. And also and we've been doing a lot of research with students from equity backgrounds, and certainly at our university we've got a lot of students who have caring responsibilities. They're studying at a distance. They perhaps don't engage at the same time. We have opportunities for asynchronous learning. Having AI tools that help them sort of figure out what's going on and support them through tasks, especially when they are time poor, is actually really helpful and could actually be more inclusive in ensuring that they are able to also meet and demonstrate learning outcomes. So it's not all bad and it's not all good, and there's certainly a lot of things we need to think about in terms of being flexible for students still.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, really great points. And it reminds me of some of the work that was done out of the pandemic where, we created all of these online resources and used all these technologies in many institutions that had never done it previously. And what we heard from a lot of students is, why didn't you have this in place to help us previously, right? So while we heard all these bad news stories about, this online learning that wasn't as, polished as it might have otherwise been, there were also a lot of opportunities for some particularly equity bearing students that they didn't have previously. So I think that's such a great point. So we've got to be mindful of the disadvantages that might be caused here, but there are also some advantages that are potentially coming out of this as well. I might go to you now, Yizhou, because you've had a bit of a break. And it's a slightly different tangent, but picks up a couple of the threads that I think are coming up in the chat.
Yeah.
So if we think about, again, going back to this idea of process, so you've done a bit of work and you've alluded to this about AI-driven scaffolding. So can you give us a more concrete sense from your research about how this might work? So for example, how do you think that we might be able to build in some of these tools to help students with writing or, advancing their kind of metacognitive processing so that they're not falling into that trap of metacognitive laziness? And then thinking beyond that to how does that then potentially help us to assess those students as they're going?
Yeah. Yeah, in the chat, I see a great question from James asking, like, phasing process is easier said than done. I can't agree more. I think this is very challenging task, and because it is difficult to measure learning process or metacognition, then that's why we were kind of collecting products, right? Accessing the final stage. The whole Flora project took like almost 5 years. We were working on collecting learning process data, translate this data into something theoretical meaningful, for example, self-regulation processes, which took lots of time. And also we collect lab data, field study data to analyze and design these scaffolds. Like we researchers and kind of expert on this, so we still took lots of time and effort. But when it comes to real classroom and university settings, we really need to not only design these platforms and tools that can be used by teachers, but we need to co-design with teachers. Not only these tools, but also the assessment or learning task. For example, the clinical reasoning task, I'm recently working with many medical school teachers. So we discuss what's the problem in this clinical reasoning practice and what you really want to access. Whether you really care about students can be correct at the end, or you care about the thinking process, right? Then the teacher discuss with us, we design this virtual standardized patient, and we collect the dialogue data between the student and the virtual standardized patient, which was kind of impossible before because previously the teachers need to play this role, and the teacher can't play this role with 200 medical students, right? So generative AI kind of provide this opportunity to help we collect the process data. So instead of at the very end, we ask students to make a decision or judgment what kind of disease this patient might be. Instead, we collect the process data. We even tell the students, this is a very challenging task. You might not be correct, right? We don't need to be we don't need you to be 100% correct, but we need you to demonstrate your thinking process along the way. Then we collect like 200 students, like there are 5 tasks, there are thousands of dialogue. The teacher realize I need to create a assessment or coding scheme to code this dialogue data, which really unpack their, for example, logical thinking, how students summarize the symptoms, right? How they challenge against potential symptoms, yeah, diseases, all this process now being shown to the teachers, and then teacher design this coding scheme. Then we as computer scientists, we start to work on automatic coding, whether we can help this analyzing the learning process or dialogue clinical reasoning process automatic, which can be scalable used. Yeah, that's a quick example, but still very difficult, very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm about to make it worse. So I'm gonna take one of the questions from the Hoover that was there before, and I'm going to ask you to try and pull together a couple of the strands of the things that you've talked about. So in an era where AI can both complete and critique student work, how can assessment practices evolve to authentically measure learning, creativity, and moral judgment? And these are some of the things that you've alluded to there, while leveraging AI to enhance feedback and academic integrity rather than undermine it. So it's sort of asking you, I think, to pull together some of the strands of what you've talked about. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. Um, I think when we use AI, we are in general offloading lots of things to AI. We ask AI to search this, to process this information, to write this, right, to create this. But while we offload at the cognitive level, there's a risk to also offload our like evaluation, monitoring, or planning to AI, which is very dangerous to me. So I think when we think about academic integrity or what is really important, we need to think about not only learning the task, but learning how to learn. If the student's still reflecting about how to learn to solve a new task, then I think I'm not saying this is 100% acceptable, but this is very important. For example, in our writing course, I'm teaching a writing course, English academic writing course in our university. Our Chinese students, they worry too much about spelling, like structure of the sentence, grammar, these things. But as I said to them, okay, these are important, but at the same time, you need to think about what you need to write yourself and how to evaluate, how to decide what to read or what to connect in your writing. This higher level evaluation of the learning process is what we really need you to learn. And the other things, for example, grammar, right? You care about that, but you can use AI or lots of things like Grammarly, these tools to help you. So you really need to think about what to offload to tools or AI, then what to unload to yourself. If you're only offloading lots of things, you are kind of cheating. But if you're offloading something to AI, but at the same time you are unloading something to yourself, especially at metacognitive level, then still learning is still happening, just at different levels. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm yeah, bringing all everything together, but this is one angle.
That's a very tough question. I think you did a good job of trying to bring the strands together. Well done. Thank you. Joe, I might turn back to you because I know you've done some work in this area. Colleen Hodgins, I think, raised an important question point in the chat. Do we at universities need to validate the learning, or could it be done in some sort of partnership with workplace settings? And I guess that's going to depend on the kind of area of study and the degree program and all those sorts of things. But can you see some role where this might interact with things like work integrated learning, for example?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's a great puzzle, I suppose, because to some programs in higher education, the workplace is the thing that counts in the end. Nursing, teaching, medicine, placements, social work, placements are compulsory, and they form a substantial part of students' progress and learning. So I guess there are still problems with work integrated learning though, and widely acknowledged that the people who are supervising students, who maybe make reports or assess the students in those workplace settings, again, don't necessarily have the training in terms of education. So in terms of feedback, they usually are reasonably au fait with the level of performance students should have, but they certainly that three-way triangle between the student, the workplace, and the educator means there is more opportunity for slippage between, what we understand to be acceptable performance, and therefore, we get potentially inconsistencies in how students are viewed in terms of their performance. So while it's a great idea in theory, how we resource this in practice and how we support everyone to have the appropriate skills and knowledge to be able to work together and support students in sort of placements or workplace settings, that's still a big question. And so, yes, I think it does require some rethinking of university learning programs. I think even in programs where workplace learning has happened and is required to happen, for many years, we still encounter issues, and students are frequently dissatisfied with, say that one particular supervisor who, maybe didn't support them very well and then gave them a terrible grade at the end of the placement. So I think how we involve workplace learning in other courses is also a really interesting question. What kind of grades or certification or credit they get for doing that workplace learning or workplace validation, that's also another question. And how this works at scale is also a really interesting question. Theoretically, it should be possible somehow, but I know even at my own institution, in some places the university organises placements, but in other situations the students have to go find placements. And there's frequently in those settings, both settings, there's frequently a mismatch between demand and supply. So yeah.
Interesting. Thanks, Joe. Well, there's so much in the answers that both of you are giving to these questions, and I think it sort of points to how complicated this all is, right? Um, I wonder if we can touch a little bit on, and maybe Joe, I'll start with you here. So we've talked a lot about what we do as institutions and what we do as educators and people who, are doing research to try and figure all of this out. I guess a big part of this is that we want students to have some agency in these processes as well. And agency is such an important kind of meta skill, a part of, that package of adaptive skills that students are going to need for their future. Um, how do we involve students in all of this? Like, where do we bring the student voice in? How do we create enough room for them to have the kind of agency and develop the kinds of skills that we're looking for within the assessment? I know that's another big question, but your thoughts on that, Joe, to start?
Yeah. Okay. So I think for students' personal individual assessments, they definitely should have some opportunity to input, demonstrate their personality, demonstrate their goals and sort of work towards developing capabilities that meet their goals, which may or may not be the same as the goals we think they have, because students are ultimately a diverse group. No person is the same as the next person. And so what students might expect to get out of an assessment is very different. And so this is where at that individual level, we should be allowing for that. But how we sort of institutionally structure things that students have input and voice into how assessment tasks unfold, and how universities are run, that's a fraught question. And I think if you grab 10 students in your class and ask them their opinion on particular things, they're going to have maybe 10 different answers. Ultimately, I think though, students generally want to be seen as students and they adopt this student role. We are in higher education, we're offering them something, entry into professional community, developing skills. And so to an extent, while student voice is really important, we should still be, we can't let students take over everything, because that would be silly. If they already knew how to assess and complete the assessments, and they knew how to set and design the assessment task, then they should be the one teaching the course, right? So we need to remember that students are students. They're there to learn. Their opinions, their perceptions are incredibly important for how we can do things better. And we do need to invite them into these conversations. I think and there is increasing expectation amongst student populations that they have this role, that they can feed something valuable into the conversation. So we do need to create spaces, but also recognize that not everyone might want to come along and have that input. And so when we are making decisions about what happens in assessment, because it is ultimately the institution's responsibility to do the assessment task, we have to take into account not only the people who have input directly, their voice, but also those other students who might not have shown up.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, a really nice summary of the sort of limitations of some of the student voice, but thinking about ways that we might include them in that conversation. We've now come to the last 10 minutes of the whole conference. Yizhou, I'm gonna turn to you to kind of start this off. I think one of the things that comes through with an event like this, a global event, is that we're all grappling with similar problems on some level, but they're playing out in different ways. So, we've got an audience here, and if you're watching this recording later on, that includes you as well. We're all in different parts of the world grappling with kind of a similar problem here.
Mhm.
I think from our perspective in Australia, there's some things that we have learned because of the unique characteristics that we have here. For example, because, as I said earlier on, we are compelled by law to assure the learning of our students. It has become very clear to us that if you allow AI use in any assessment task, you are accepting the absolute certainty that there will be some students who will use it for the whole task. Right? We know that for a fact. So the idea that you can ask students to do the right thing and they'll do the right thing just isn't playing out. Like that's not what's happening. So that's one thing that we've been able to glean from our context that might look different in very different parts of the world. And you mentioned something similar before about research. So what are some of the ways that you think that we might be able to look at some of these universal challenges and, outside of a venue like this, which is a fantastic forum for us to be able to share where we're all at? What are some of the other ways you think we might work together to figure all this out?
Yeah, talking about like cultural context, China or East or the whole Asia, lots of Chinese students, and Asian students, they might be very good at exams or trying working very hard, as long as there is a clear standard, clear rubric, so we beat the system. In a way, this is kind of good. They work very hard. But if there's a problem, it's not well defined, not very clear with clear standards, then this is something in Chinese education system we really need to think about because the whole education system is built surrounding assessment, exams, right, in high school and even in the universities. But we start to work with students. For example, in my academic writing course, the very first class we talk about academic integrity, right, ethical guidelines. Then we kind of design activity with the students. They need to tell me what they consider is ethical or unethical. Then I give them like 10, 15 questions. Then students need to vote like by walking within the classroom. And after this task, many students came to me saying, "Oh, this is the first time I start to discuss something is not clearly defined by teachers or by the school, by the university." And I also learned how to understand each other, like understand my classmates, because for my 15 questions, there's no one question every students agree on A or B, right? There are always disagreement. So I'm not 100% like letting them to decide the rules in the writing course, but I create an opportunity for them to discuss what is their understanding and understanding other students' mind. So I think this is very important because there's uncertainty in there, and in the future society, there's a lot of uncertainty and openness. This sense of order, how to build sense of order, right? Of our students is very important. Then this is something very universal. For example, our students need to not only learn the skills and knowledge, but also needs to kind of improve their AI literacy or in general very basic literacy, like asking good questions, feedback literacy, sense of order, like how they understand systematically. These are very fundamental literacy and universal in a way. And when they save more time for this fundamental sense, they are kind of finding themselves in this learning journey instead of just working on the improving their grades. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice. Thank you. Joe, some final thoughts from you. Where is all this headed? You work in one of the world's, most renowned assessment research centers. What's your sense of where we're going next with all of this?
I think where we're going is that we need more empirical work to be done in order for us to be able to make better decisions about what happens next. There's been so much conjecture, so much great conceptual work that's been happening over the past 3 years that I think we're really looking to see, what actually is happening, how are students responding, what are students' outcomes, and from there, then we might be able to make better, more informed decisions. And when I say empirical work, I mean all sorts. I mean learning analytics. I mean qualitative work. I mean large-scale studies. I mean very small, in-depth studies, because all of these things will help us better understand what it is that we're dealing with, how it's changing what we do, and what we need to do next.
Nice. Yizhou, anything to add there? Or please feel free, audience, add comments. Where do you think we need to go next with all of this?
Yeah, lots of great comments. And I agree with Joe that empirical study is very important for us to understand, for example, how students interact with AI, how they interact with each other, and how they can be motivated to find a new solution in uncertainty. This is very important. And also, our study about metacognition laziness or offloading is very important also in the assessment. When we definitely offloading something, what to offload, how to offload, what to unload, how as teachers how to design scaffoldings to unload students. Like metacognition is quite important, but there's lots of unknown in this area. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
shout out to Shahin for their comments that we need more resources. So more
Yeah.
funding.
Yes.
Yeah, it's hard not to agree with that one, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we might sort of wrap it up shortly, but I think fully agree that we need to do the empirical work. I think I notice Dragon's in the room with us now. He's been saying that for about 18 months that there's been a lot of conceptual work, Joe, as you've said, but we now need to sort of start to collect some data. I think the other thing that strikes me is that, and this came up in one of the other panels, is this gap between the sort of empirical work that many of us are starting to get involved in, and when that actually starts to impact on practice and policy. And I think the point about us having a lack of resources is well made, and part of that issue is that there is such a long lag time between the ways in which we start to figure all of this out and how that gets communicated to make real change in education systems. And those systems are stuck in some of the ways that they operate for good reasons and some not so good reasons. So I think that there are challenges in multiple directions here. We've got to continue to do the research to figure all of this out. But I think there's also a component in all of this where we're having some of those conversations with policymakers, that we're thinking about working closely with people who are doing the teaching on the ground, that we're having the conversations with the tech companies and they have a role in all of this as well. And I'm hoping that over the last few days of the conference that we've all had a sense of how these conversations are happening globally. So thank you everybody for joining us for this session. We hope that you got a lot out of the conference, and we hope to see you all continuing doing good work, so that we can figure out these problems together, and we'll have more opportunities to share the outcomes of that work in the years to come, because there is no doubt that we have much work left to do. If I could ask the audience to join me in thanking our panelists. Fantastic responses. There's a lot for me to think about now in the issues that you've raised. And I see George is here with us. George, would you like to have the last word as the
Yes,
the
well,
conference
thanks.
chair, if you
First of all,
like?
it was a very good indication of how critical this is as a domain of interest, given how active it's, I think, probably the most active comment section I've seen from the various panels. So this is clearly something that's on everyone's mind. And I think you very ably and adeptly unpacked the scope of it. And I really appreciate your comments, Jason, around this is very much a global conversation, and it's happening in different regions, and the ability to connect and collaborate is central to that. I'm just going to do a little bit of a wrap-up thing here. Where am I? Just to sort of give you a bit of an indication of where we're at. I think, as I've mentioned before, we have pretty good turnout. I previously introduced what Grail is, what Grail does, the group behind the conferences. We had a pretty impressive turnout, if you will. We had 52 hours of actual conference time and online events, so that's not insignificant. We once again booked out at 1,500. We have a limited budget because of how we use Whova. We're not a well-resourced organization necessarily, but we had an outstanding turnout as a whole, a lot of community board discussions. Not everybody got into Whova. It's its own beast. Not everybody loves it, but we had good engagement there, a number of meetups where people got together, quite a range of private conversations and engagement and so on. So I'm really just trying to emphasize, for each of you that joined, those of you that stayed, you were part of, exactly like Jason articulated, it's a global conversation. And I don't think we know the path forward yet. It's not that we know where we ought to go. This isn't a defined space where we understand what needs to happen with AI. We're co-evolving. You see some of the stuff that was dropped this week with Agent Kit, with OpenAI. You look at some of the drops that Anthropic did today, specifically around accelerating the use of Claude Code. We're in an entangled race with a group of providers that are delivering tools at an incredibly fast pace that's going to have a direct impact on what our students do and on what faculty do, or what teachers and what students do in the primary secondary system. So I think the reason why events like this are so important is it gives us a window to pause, to hear what others are doing and to sort of collaboratively make sense a bit of the landscape. And the reason that's so critical, and Gary Klein has a fantastic statement, he says, sense making is the stabilizing of the streaming of experience. And when I hear, the number of people from around the world that have been presenting that have talked about everything from privacy to ethics to proper deployment, we had a large number of tools being demoed throughout the event, fantastic keynote speakers on creativity and self-regulation, outstanding focus on do we need a new economic model in university sector like the cooperative model and so on. There's really this sense, I think as educators, our heart's in the right place, but we need to network and collaborate because we absolutely do not have $1 trillion of CapEx spend that's happening in the big tech space. So thanks very much for taking the time to learn with us and to share what you know with all of us. We're going to start turning shortly to evaluating, do we do a 6th year or not? A few people have reached out already to help organize. If you're in that boat, please let me know. For now, thanks for a fantastic concluding panel to the event. You'll hear some updates from us soon on just a bit of assessment to make sure that, what can we do that you would like to see more of or less of. So again, thank you. Enjoy the day, and conference is done.